Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today here on Point of View. One of the things I want to talk about is something that has been unfolding here in the Dallas area, which is actually already getting national attention as well, and that is the shooting that took place by Amber Geiger. So I want to get into that in just a few minutes, and also maybe learn some lessons from that, because there are some things to be said before the gun went off. There's some lessons to learn after it did, and how maybe the Dallas police force and others could have handled it differently in terms of just the PR issue. So we'll certainly talk about that. Since we are certainly in the state of Texas, I also want to point out the fact that now the Republican Party and others are saying it is maybe time for Donald Trump to come here and help out Ted Cruz, and for more money to be poured into a race that was assumed by the Republican National Committee to actually be a gimme. And it is anything but, and so we'll get into that. A little bit later, I do want to just read one or two things that people have said about Serena Williams, because we mentioned that before, but probably won't get into that in a lot of detail. And, of course, President Obama's been out on the campaign trail, and some of the things he's said have caused some people to think about these issues as well. So lots of things to cover here on Point of View. And I was going to cover this story out of the Dallas police force yesterday, but we were preempted by the NASCAR race, which was rebroadcast because it rained on Sunday. And so I thought we would come back to this. And this particular piece by Sharon Grigsby in the Dallas Morning News, I think, does a good job of maybe focusing on what I might say, what happened before the shooting. And there are lots of questions surrounding that. But then there is a lesson to be learned after the shooting, and that is, you've heard the phrase, silence is golden. Not always. There are times when it's probably good just keep your mouth shut, not to say anything when you don't know something. But there is a lesson that is starting to leak out on the dangers in the public relations realm of not saying anything. And you can see this right now unfolding in a different venue out of the Vatican, where the silence from the Pope has allowed all sorts of speculation, because indeed there have been allegations, there have been accusations, there have been some pretty significant letters and other testimonies coming out. And when the Pope and those in the Vatican don't say anything, it makes, I think, a problem worse. And as we'll say in just a minute, when it took so long to finally say we need to charge Amber Geiger with some kind of manslaughter, of course, I think it's going to be bumped up, but we'll get into that a little bit later, issue, that just allowed there to be even more of a protest than there might have been before. Even if there had not been a decision as to whether to charge her or what to charge her, some things that could have been said might have tamped down some of the emotions, which, of course, are pretty high, because this one is really hard to get your head around. Because it's one thing when there is a struggle between a police officer and someone else, or there are mixed allegations about whether or not somebody said, hands up, don't shoot, or whether or not this was a action that was premeditated or the rest. But again, there is just simply no way to explain away what indeed has taken place. And that's why I wanted to read in its entirety this piece by Sharon Grigsby, because I think it illustrates, even in the title, what she says. Even if everything the Dallas cop says is true, her decision to pull the trigger was a crime. Now, Sharon Grigsby says this: there's no way to wrap your head around the image. With the workday behind you, snug in the evening in your own apartment, the place you feel safest, you're confronted by a uniformed police officer with a gun. That's the last thing Botham Jean saw. The horror show unfolded, as she points out, Thursday night at the Southside Flats, just blocks away from police headquarters. In effect, an off-duty police officer staged a deadly home invasion. Only by her account, she thought it was her home that had been invaded. Here's the thing, though. The possibility that her actions were unwitting doesn't absolve Amber Geiger, who was finally arrested Sunday and booked into the Kaufman County Jail on manslaughter charge. She quickly made bail and left through the back of the facility. The police officer had moved to the Cedars apartment complex about a month ago. She had served in the Dallas Police Department for almost 5 years and earned a spot fighting crime in some of the hottest spots in the southeast part of the city. She also shot a man in the stomach in 2017 when he grabbed her taser during an arrest that turned violent. He survived and is serving prison time. She was not indicted in that incident. Based on what Amber Geiger told investigating officers, she had never met Botham Jean, who she ended his life before she ended his life. But Jean, a native of the Caribbean island of St. Lucia, sounds like the kind of big-hearted person we all would like to count among our friends. Deeply religious, almost bubbly with joy, and committed to whatever task was in front of him, the 26-year-old, known by many as Bo, was willing to go the extra mile for most anyone with whom he crossed paths. He was a mentor to at-risk youths, song leader in his sanctuary, devoted son and brother, active alumnus of Harding University in Arkansas, valued employee at PricewaterhouseCoopers accounting and auditing firm. Botham Jean was exactly the sort of citizen we want to have in our city of Dallas, which, of course, is a statement by Mayor Mike Rawlings, who said that on Saturday. The Dallas Police Association president, Mike Motta, put it this way: Mr. Jean was an amazing individual, and he is what we as parents hope our children turn out to be. You say, again, Sharon Grigsby puts it this way. She says, statements like these are what you would expect, especially given the tensions between Dallas law enforcement and the city's residents of color. And Botham Jean does sound like a really special guy. But all of that is beside the point. Whether or not he led a near-perfect life and had a sterling character matters not one bit. Every time an unarmed civilian is killed by a cop, the social fabric frays a little further, and faith in the rule of law takes a grave hit. That man, Jean, a black man, was killed by a white cop only adds to the tragedy. A sacred contract exists between police and the people they protect and serve. We grant them extraordinary powers, need them to do their duty to keep the rest of us safe. We also expect them to use those powers widely and wisely. None of these meager facts known so far or the hints dropped by sources from inside knowledge alter that fundamental duty. Even the scenario most sympathetic to Geiger, she was off duty, she parked on the wrong floor of the parking garage, she thought she was entering her apartment, the door was unlocked, the lights were out, doesn't give her license to be so quick on the trigger. As crazy as her story sounds, it may be true. Perhaps this was a deadly playing out of what neuroscience tells us. Shifting one's perception is akin to moving a mountain. If she believed she was at her apartment, she literally might not see evidence to the contrary, like the apartment number on the wall and the unfamiliar red doormat. But that doesn't lessen her responsibility. Even if she believed the apartment was hers, what would justify her decision to shoot? When we come back, I want to talk about that in more detail and consider different scenarios. If indeed this is true and she's in the wrong apartment, how long before she felt need to actually pull the trigger? And maybe some lessons each one of us can learn if we find ourselves in a similar situation. Let's take a break. We've got a lot more to cover right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
When voters go to the polls, they need to not only pay attention to congressional races, but also the races for state legislature. Karl Rove refers to this as the other House race. We talked about his commentary recently on Point of View. These days, most people are focusing on the elections of the U.S. House of Representatives. About 60 of the 435 elections will be competitive and ultimately determine whether Republicans or Democrats control the House next year. The other House race is at the state level. Who the voters elect to state legislatures will determine the congressional districts in the next decade. That's why we should also pay attention to the battle over 6,000 contests this fall and another 6,000 races next year and in 2020. Since most state senators serve 4-year terms, those elected this November will be the ones casting votes on congressional redistricting plans. None of this has escaped the notice of political parties. Republicans currently hold 67 of 99 chambers. They control both legislatures in 32 states. By contrast, Democrats have legislative majorities in both houses in 14 states. None of this should escape the notice of voters. Who you vote for in the state legislative races this fall and in the near future will determine who you can elect in Congress a few years from now. Remember that I mentioned that only 60 of the 435 races for the House of Representatives are competitive races. I might add that the number is a bit higher than usual because so many Republican members of Congress decided to resign this election. This is yet another reminder that you really need to pay attention to all the candidates you elect up and down the ballot. It will have an impact on you in the future. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From Universal 1440, Unbroken, Path to Redemption, the rest of World War II hero Louis Zamperini's true story, in theaters September 14th, rated PG-13.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, I'd love to get any comments from some of you, especially in the Dallas area that have been following the story for a number of days. Amber Geiger. And, of course, even if you are not familiar with the story, we're going through it right now. And it just, again, raises some very important questions, not only in terms of police actions and what this one individual did, but if you are an individual that carries a firearm, maybe you have a concealed carry permit, or maybe you at least have access to one in your home, at what point do you make the decision that your life is in danger and you actually pull the trigger? If you've ever been through any training, you know that it has to be life-threatening, and walking into an apartment that is dark, not knowing necessarily who is there, is sometimes seen as akin to the hunter who is out with his rifle, sees some rustling in the bushes and fires, only to find out that it was not a deer that he was shooting at in the first place, but another hunter or a dog or a cow or something of that nature. So that is, of course, one of those questions we can ask before pulling the trigger. But in just a few minutes, I also want to get into how could the Dallas police force have handled this more effectively, and maybe you would also like to express your opinion as to whether or not this is manslaughter or whether this is negligent homicide or murder. And, of course, the number of facts are certainly up for some kind of grabs. That's why we have courts of law. That's why we have various kinds of juries to consider this. That's why indictments actually take place, and there is a long, tedious process of collecting as much information as possible. But let me come back to the story for just a minute. Taking even her scenario at face value, that she parked on the wrong floor and then she thought she was entering her own apartment. She acknowledges that the door was unlocked and the lights were out, and she saw an unfamiliar figure. Is that reason enough to pull the trigger? Now, there's some other questions that are surrounding this. One is there's been all sorts of, and I'm going to get to this in a minute, wildly inaccurate information. But some of the other information has come that said that she was pounding on the door. Now, was that her, or was that somebody else down the street, or did people misremember? Those are, of course, big issues as well. It's easy to say, well, didn't she notice that her key didn't fit the door? Didn't she notice that there was a red doormat and she doesn't have one of those? Yes, well, that brings us back to, I think, one of the really striking comments by Sharon Grigsby, because she points out that neuroscience tells us shifting one's perception is akin to moving a mountain. If you really did believe it was your apartment, you may not have seen evidence to the contrary. The example I like to use for you, has there ever been a time when you're in a parking lot and you go up and try to get into the wrong car? Now, if that has never happened to you, you haven't been alive very long, because almost all of us at one time or another go into a parking lot, we see a car that is the same color as our car. We go up and we try to open it. Maybe if it was unlocked, you even open it up and you look in and go, wait a minute, this is not my car. Or even worse, somebody's sitting in the passenger seat and you get into the driver's seat. And I have seen that unfold one time with my wife. Interesting, very interesting stuff. But anyway, those are all kind of fun stories that just illustrate again that it is possible that you have to collect enough negative information to say, wait a minute, this is not my car. Or in this case, wait a minute, this is not my apartment. With the lights out, of course, that makes it a lot more difficult. And so, again, the point that Sharon Grigsby was making is, let's, even as the title of her editorial says, even if everything the Dallas cop says is true, her decision to pull the trigger was a crime. Because, okay, didn't notice that she had the wrong apartment number, did not notice the red doormat, maybe completely was convinced that somebody was in her apartment. At the very least, you would expect something along the lines of stop, halt, what are you doing in my apartment? Something like that. If somebody rushes you, knocks you down, that, of course, would be probably enough justification for using deadly force. But that's not what we have here. And so the first issue is all the kinds of questions that you would have to ask yourself if you have concealed carry or if you have a firearm in your home and you end up seeing an individual. Is just seeing an individual in your house justification enough to shoot them? And, of course, that's one of the big questions that certainly is going to be surrounding this, even if we take her particular story at face value. I think as time goes on, we're going to find out maybe there were some other factors going on there as well, but that's at least point number one. Let me get to point number two, because how could law enforcement have handled this more effectively? The silence from the Dallas police force was something that I think increased the concern. When there's been a shooting, obviously some things have to happen simultaneously. Actually obtaining the weapon, which I'm sure they did, putting a person on hold, and a variety of other issues, but also a natural press conference to say we're in the moment considering what charges are going to be brought would be better than not saying anything. And so Sharon Grigsby picks up on that as well. The bizarre nature of the story makes it all the more important that law enforcement present the facts to the public as expediently as possible. In the absence of much real information, social media users are offering up all sorts of wildly inaccurate information and jumping to crazy-making conclusions. For example, somebody found a picture of someone who looked like Amber Geiger with a picture of this individual that was actually shot. And so as a result, there was this speculation that Botham Jean and Amber Geiger had a relationship, maybe even were boyfriend-girlfriend, or there was some kind of conflict. No evidence to that at all. But when, again, silence comes from law enforcement, It makes it much easier for all sorts of inaccurate information and even crazy making kind of conclusions being drawn. Then, Sharon Grigsby goes on to say that Dallas Police Chief Renee Hall says getting to the bottom of this case is the aim of her department. Repeatedly since the story began unwinding Thursday night, she has stressed the need to be as transparent as possible. She's part of the effort is bringing in the Texas Rangers to head up the investigation. But after 3 days of, here's our key word, silence on the Rangers' part, what some in law enforcement would characterize as an agency methodically doing its work began to look a lot like, what? Foot dragging. People were understandably angry about the delay in issuing a formal charge, especially after police said Friday they were seeking an arrest warrant for manslaughter. Then the chief said Saturday a judge had not signed a warrant because the Rangers had learned new information and wanted to investigate further. Perhaps with Amber Geiger now charged, a complete picture of Thursday night's tragedy will emerge. Prudence is a virtue, but prolonged silence in a situation as fraught as this one can only make a crazy time even crazier. So again, the lesson that I would point out for us is before you pull the trigger and before you are in a situation where someday, let's hope none of us ever have to, but let's suppose you have to defend your family or your home. There is a reasonable time to evaluate what you're just about ready to do. And the sad reality is sometimes that opportunity to evaluate that takes place in less than a second because of the circumstances that unfold before you. But again, that is a lesson we can learn from Amber Geiger, which again, fortunately, most of us will never have to deal with. We expect our police officers to be superhuman, to make split-second decisions based upon fractional information, and to always do it in a way that could be perceived by somebody who has the luxury of hours of reflection to come to the same conclusion. But there is another lesson that I thought I would mention, and it is the problem of silence. We've been seeing this over the last couple of weeks with the Pope and some of the allegations that have come from him and the silence from the Vatican, which, if nothing else, just reinforce the idea that maybe there's something to many of these allegations and the fact that maybe there was a cover-up. And the silence from the Dallas police force is, again, a tendency for people to wonder if indeed there are attempts to protect this individual from prosecution. And the greater opportunity to show the transparency that we were actually promised by the chief, Renee Hall, the better. So, and again, just a couple of lessons, sadly, vicarious lessons, hopefully, that we can learn from that set of circumstances. And if you'd like to join our conversation, love to know what you think about what has transpired here with Amber Geiger and the Dallas Police Force. So if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. If you'd like to leave a comment, we also, of course, broadcast live on Facebook Live. You can leave a comment there. I'll read those as well. When we come back, we've got an election ahead of us, and Ted Cruz looks like he's in trouble. We'll talk about that right after this.
There is no more dangerous time than when things are going well. Remember Elijah on Mount Carmel? Fire came down. There was no doubt who was God, but what happened next? He went from amazing faith to a time of great fear and depression. Many Christians have been very thankful a certain Democratic candidate for president was not the one to nominate two replacements for the Supreme Court. But as with Elijah, times of great victory are also times of great danger. Moments like this are not the time to take it easy. This is not the time to let our guard down. This is a time to double down on our work in the community, to serve and pray and plan and invest in a better future. This is the time to join Point of View's Truth Team 360 to make sure today's promising gains are not lost tomorrow. Show your commitment to our future by visiting pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Ask to join the Truth Team. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
You file this under "this was not supposed to happen." When you look at the race that Ted Cruz was supposed to win hands down, it has not been that case, and it has required a reorientation of a couple of things. First of all, when you have the President of the United States, whether it's in the past Barack Obama or in this case Donald Trump, you want to bring those individuals into particular races that are close, where the president's words would make a difference. And, of course, you have seen the president go to Michigan, Pennsylvania, most recently Montana, and other places. And, of course, you would not have thought that there was any desire to bring President Donald Trump to a race involving Ted Cruz for a couple of reasons. Number one, you would assume that Ted Cruz would do relatively well and win at least 60% of the vote or more, perhaps even if he was very popular, 70% of the vote. Number two, you wouldn't want to bring him there because do you remember all the negative things that were said by President Donald Trump about Ted Cruz? Yeah, that doesn't help, because you know when he gets off of Air Force One and speaks at a rally, the press are going to remind us of all of those comments. So the fact that there are people seriously talking about bringing the president to Texas to campaign for Ted Cruz, first of all, is an indication of how close the race might be. The fact that the Republican National Committee, which wanted to spend money on other contested races, think Tennessee, think Indiana, think Missouri, think Montana, think West Virginia, where there would be a chance for a senatorial Republican pickup, or in the case of Tennessee, to keep that as a Republican seat. Those dollars, which were supposed to go to those key races, now they're talking about spending money in the state of Texas. A couple of points that I thought were indicating what has happened, and then we'll move on to some other things in the campaign. Texas Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick personally requested President Trump get involved in Senator Ted Cruz's campaign re-election to boost turnout amid an increasingly close campaign. And this was reported by Politico, also in the article that is in The Hill. Dan Patrick, who is, again, the Lieutenant Governor of the state of Texas, was the chairman of Trump's 2016 campaign in Texas, reportedly asked the White House officials during a July trip to Washington, D.C. about sending Trump to the state to campaign on Cruz's behalf. Lieutenant Governor argued that an appearance from Trump would provide a necessary turnout boost for state Republicans. The Hill also reached out to both Patrick and the White House for comment. Patrick's reported request was soon followed by Cruz saying he'd welcome a visit from Trump during the campaign season. Late last month, the president followed through, announcing he planned to hold a rally at the biggest stadium in Texas we can find. The date and location of the rally have yet to be announced. Trump and Cruz frequently, as I mentioned just a minute ago, exchanged barbs during the 2016 campaign for the Republican presidential nomination. Trump labeled the senator Lying Ted, remember that one? And mocked his family, while Cruz called the then candidate a sniveling coward and a pathological liar. Do you think any of those comments are going to surface once Donald Trump gets off Air Force One and does the rally? Of course they are. Well, nevertheless, let's get back to the issue. Ted Cruz is running against Representative O'Rourke right now in November's election. O'Rourke has generated significant enthusiasm, raising millions of dollars in the process. While Cruz remains the favorite in a solidly Republican Texas, a clear politics average of the polls shows at least a Representative O'Rourke within striking distance by roughly 4 percentage points. The Cook Political Report, a non-political election forecaster, shifted the race last month from likely Republican to lean Republican, and before it's all through, might even be a toss-up. And one of the other quotes here is from Mick Mulvaney, but I thought I'd go to the New York Times piece because it goes into that in more detail. New York Times had a piece, Top Trump Advisor Says Ted Cruz Could Lose Texas Senate Race. A pair of top Republicans acknowledged in a private meeting, says the New York Times, on Saturday that the party was battling serious vulnerabilities in the midterm elections, including what one described as widespread hate for President Trump, and raised the prospect that Senator Ted Cruz of Texas could lose the bid for re-election because he is not seen as likable enough. The two Republican leaders, by the way, are Mick Mulvaney, who's the federal budget director, and Ronna McDaniel, who is the Republican National Committee chairwoman. And they assured party officials and donors at a closed-door event in New York City that the various groups would eventually turn back the so-called blue wave in November. Mr. Mulvaney also questioned whether Democrats could marshal support from outside the left, criticizing them as a party defined solely by opposition to Donald Trump. And also, Mulvaney and McDaniel also offered an unusually raw assessment, according to the New York Times, of their own party's strengths and weaknesses in the midterm elections. They pointed to the burning energy among Democratic voters and the dozens of open House seats where Republican incumbents decided not to seek re-election as fearsome obstacles to retaining control of Congress. Might just mention that my commentary today is actually referred to as the other House race. And the reason I do that is because I point out the fact that already people are not only looking at these congressional and senatorial races, but these statewide races, because they will determine in the future, for example, how various congressional districts are apportioned. I've jokingly said many times before that the people choose their senators and the members of Congress choose their voters. So it's kind of interesting because the voters actually determine the senators, but when you come to Congress, lots of times these state legislatures working with their congressional representatives choose which voters they will actually have to appear before and thus increase their likelihood of being reelected. In my commentary, I point out that as best as Karl Rove, since he looks at these numbers better than any of us can guess, we have 435 elections for Congress, but only 60 of those are anywhere at all considered to be competitive. And the same thing with the Senate. We have, I think it's 34 Senate races right now, and less than a dozen of those would be competitive as well, because most states are either red or blue. And when you go to the congressional ones, they are almost like ruby red or are very dark blue, because they are constrained in such a way to virtually guarantee that an incumbent will be reelected. So part of the argument that came from this particular meeting is that Ted Cruz doesn't quite have the personality of other campaigns and other candidates, and that, along with a variety of other issues, might make it difficult for him to win. Even if he does, and most people still believe that he will have cost a fair amount of political capital. The president will have to come to Texas when that wasn't something he really needed to do. The money that the RNC was going to spend on other senatorial races has to come here, and you can kind of see some of the difficulty. But at the same time, let's also remind ourselves that the former president has been out campaigning as well. Gary Bauer says the media have been celebrating Barack Obama's return to the political stage since his speech at the University of Illinois last Friday. But he said the narrative is wrong. I would argue that Obama never left the scene. Yeah, true, but this is one thing where I was a little surprised. I honestly thought that there would just be this ongoing campaign by Barack Obama. He's kind of waited a year or two, but now is in full fluster to try to do what he can as quickly as possible to begin to reinsert himself. And one of the things he said, which we talked about last Friday, was former President Barack Obama claimed that he is responsible for the improved economic growth that we've seen. Gary Bauer had a little bit of fun with that and said, well, it's like a football coach with 8 losing seasons being replaced and then attempting to take credit for the turnaround that occurs under a new coach. Because as we've pointed out, not a lot of economic growth in the 8 years when Barack Obama was president, and very significant economic growth taking place as well. He also said the speech by President Barack Obama was vintage Obama. He referred to himself 102 times. And there's a lot more, but we'll get into that a little bit later. But I thought there was one thing that I thought was most significant from the speech, and that's our friend Dr. Merrill Matthews points out that Barack Obama has sometimes flip-flopped on issues. You know, he was, for example, against the idea of same-sex marriage, later supported it. He has always been saying that he was against single payer. We knew that he was not. But in his recent speech, he actually said, so Democrats aren't running on good old ideas like higher minimum wage. They're also running on good new ideas like Medicare for all. So you can see now that he's come forward with this idea of Medicare for all. It's not necessarily a good new idea, Dr. Merrill Matthews said, because you can go all the way back to President Harry Truman back in the late 1940s arguing for that. But this is a significant difference. Whereas before, it was really just Bernie Sanders for Medicare for all. Now it's almost all the Democratic leadership. We'll be right back.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. A federal court in Oklahoma has ruled that despite the religious ardor of some of its adherents, environmentalism is not a religion. Randall Krause filed a lawsuit against the Tulsa County Library Commission. Evidently, the commission maintains a recycling program, and according to Krause, it constitutes an undue burden on the free exercise of his environmentalism. Krause alleged that the commission had placed fake recycling bins throughout town, victimizing him and other adherents to environmentalism. Well, the judge didn't buy the argument. Dismissing the case, the court explained that Krause had failed to establish that his environmentalism was anything more than personal preferences and secular beliefs without foundation in any religion. And even if it were, the fake recycling bins placed around town did not amount to a coercive law meriting protection by the First Amendment. Determining what is a religion is difficult for any court, but as the Supreme Court has explained, religious beliefs need not be acceptable, logical, consistent, or comprehensible to others in order to merit First Amendment protection. But the court does require beliefs to be rooted in a religion in order to trigger protection under the religion clauses of the First Amendment. For now, at least in Tulsa, environmentalism does not constitute a valid religion, but it leaves me with one nagging question. Is a fake recycling bin just a trash can? To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
For a few more minutes, let me, if I can, spend some time talking about role models, because that is certainly something that has become front and center. We'll look at sports, and then we'll look at the president. And there are some very interesting things that have been written about this more recently. The first, of course, as I mentioned yesterday, Serena Williams and her behavior at the U.S. Open. And I thought it was intriguing to see that there have been a few people that have had some comments about that. And one of those is Martina Navratilova. And I won't read all of the piece here, just to simply say that she has actually begun to say maybe this is a time for Serena Williams to think again about the impact that she's having on the sport and upon others that watch her behavior. Now, again, this comes from Martina Navratilova. 18 times won the Grand Slam in the singles department, and certainly an individual that conducted herself on the court with some level of decorum. But let's again remind ourselves of the situation. This one from Samuel Chamberlain writing, Martina Navratilova criticizes Serena Williams' behavior at the U.S. Open final. That is, Serena Williams was cited 3 times by chair umpire Carlos Ramos during the second set of her 6-2, 6-4 loss to Naomi Osaka in Saturday's singles final. The first penalty for getting coaching signals earned her a warning. The second penalty for breaking her racket cost her a point. The third penalty for berating Ramos and calling him a thief cost her a game. Now, Williams argued that Ramos would not have penalized her so harshly if she were a man. And the WTA CEO, Steve Simon, agreed, saying in a statement that the organization believes that there should be no difference in the standards of tolerance provided to the emotions expressed by men versus women. We do not believe that that was done Saturday night. Okay, so on the one hand, we believe we should have a level playing field. On the other hand, we don't believe that that was the problem. So what does Martina Navratilova have to say? She said that she thought this issue, this charge of sexism, is missing the point. Okay, what is the point? I love this quote from Martina. She says, "We cannot measure ourselves by what we think we should be able to get away with." She says, instead, there have been many times when I was playing that I wanted to break my racket into 1,000 pieces. But then I thought about the kids watching, and I grudgingly held on to that racket. Interesting. A little bit later, she said, had I behaved like that on a tennis court, I would have expected to get everything that happened to Serena. She even told this to one of the Times reporters. It should have ended with a point warning, but Serena just couldn't let it go. So again, she talks about the fact that maybe there is a double standard for women over men and all the things. But the point she was making is that I don't believe, this was one of her last lines, that it's a good idea to apply a standard of if men can get away with it, women should be able to. Rather, I think the question we should ask ourselves is this: what is the right way to behave to honor our sport and to respect our opponents? Gotta love that. Well, if nothing else, that is just one more thought about do we expect athletes to be role models? And of course, you've heard many athletes say, look, I'm not a role model. I think in the best of all worlds, we would like an individual that not only plays the sport well, but also is a role model. And of course, sometimes we see people that we think play the sport well as a good role model, but in the case of Tim Tebow, gets left off anyway, or maybe you might think Colin Kaepernick or some of the others. But nevertheless, this, I think, would be the ideal. And when we come to now our president, should the president be a role model? Well, most Americans think he should be, and most Americans are convinced that he's not. This comes from Dennis Prager, but the most recent Quinnipiac poll says most voters say President Donald Trump is not a good role model for children. While 90% of voters say that the president should be a good role model for kids, only 29% say that he is, while 67% say he is not. Now, he goes through trying to maybe put this in some context. I think the point I'm going to make is that in the best of all worlds, we would want an individual that was right on the issues, has quality people around them, and is a person of great character. And if you get 3 for 3, you're doing real well, but sometimes it doesn't happen. So here's how Dennis Prager answers that question. I don't completely agree, but I just wanted to give you a chance to think about it and to recognize that at least he's taking on the issue of whether or not this president is a girl role model. And he said the answer should be obvious. I'm disappointed that all conservatives do not really understand it. The role of the president of the United States is first and foremost to be a good president. If he or she is a personal role model, that's a lovely bonus. But it's only a bonus. When I was young, I never regarded the President of the United States as a personal role model. That task fell to my father, my grandfather, my older brother, my uncles, my parents, friends, teachers, rabbis, and older males. He goes on to say that President Jimmy Carter was known to be a faithful and devoted husband and was not known for making false statements, although he does get in a dig here, only libelous ones after leaving office, like calling Israel an apartheid state. So what? Do conservative never-Trumpers think that Jimmy Carter's personal integrity mattered more or his presidential decisions? And, of course, then he goes on to say, well, I would take Donald Trump's character over Hillary Clinton's. That's lowering some things pretty much. But here, the point he makes is Donald Trump is responsible for the lowest unemployment in generations, for appointing 2 conservative Supreme Court justices, for boosting defense spending, for confronting the whole issue of illegal immigration, for cutting government regulations, for strongly supporting Israel, for lowering taxes, for confronting Western European countries over their morally indefensible low defense spending, and so much more that anyone who calls himself conservative should celebrate. Those achievements, not to mention preventing a left-wing Democratic Party victory in 2016, are what should matter to every conservative and every American frightened about what the left was doing to our country, to its universities, high schools, families, gender relations, and race relations, and everything else it touches. So here's kind of his illustration. If your house were on fire, would you be more concerned with the character of the firefighters sent to extinguish the fire or their firefighting ability? And, of course, that's the argument that has been made so many times before. I would be the first to say that most people would say that Jimmy Carter was a person of integrity, but he didn't have a real good foreign policy, and he really had difficulties as the president. You have others who we recognize might have been a little more effective in getting various pieces of legislation through Congress. Lyndon Johnson is a classic illustration, whose moral life was certainly not something to celebrate. And Donald Trump has been able to achieve quite a bit, but again, his moral life hasn't been anything that people would celebrate. In the best of all worlds, you'd like to have somebody that would be fun to be around, somebody with great character, and somebody who accomplished a great deal. Ronald Reagan comes to mind, but there aren't many of them out there. And so, again, it is, I think, lamentable that this president is not a good role model for children and for our country. And the coarsening of our culture is happening from Hollywood. It's happening from the media. It's happening from a lot of venues. And so to blame all of that on Donald Trump is unfair. But to ignore the impact, I think, is also a little bit irresponsible. Well, let's take a break. When we come back, when we have the national audience, I want to spend some time talking about something that happened 17 years ago, 9/11. We've posted some articles related to that, and I'll be reading those and getting your comments. And then a little bit later, we're going to be joined by a number of guests that I think you're going to find interesting and fascinating as well. My commentary today is on the other House race. I would encourage you to sign up to get the Viewpoints commentary if you haven't already done so, and find some of the articles we're going to be reading from in just a minute. All available on our website, pointofview.net. We'll be back right after this.
Point of View turned life right side up for Emily's children. Emily listens in Illinois. She and her husband blissfully sent their children off each day to what she called our small, quaint public school, until Point of View led them to watch the documentary Indoctrination. She said, "We came to realize the need for us to educate our children at home. We want their education to be built on the solid foundation of Scripture." Emily said that would not have happened were it not for Point of View's bold consistency of shining light on public education. Your support for Point of View changes the future for children like Emily's. It leads people to start schools and ministries and businesses that change lives. How has the Truth Team impacted you? Please invest to bring truth to other families like Emily's. Support Truth today. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the 17th anniversary of 9/11. So we're going to spend some time talking about that in the first half of this hour. And then we're going to be talking about looking not back 17 years, but 100 years to another very important series of events in September of 1918. We are, of course, in 2018. And then a little bit later in the second hour, going to be talking about the whole idea of military service and PTSD. And before it's all through, we'll get back to some of the issues in the news. Certainly we have some things having to do with the campaigns. My commentary today is on the other House race, but also we see former President Barack Obama has asserted himself into certain campaigns. President Donald Trump may actually travel to Texas to campaign for Ted Cruz. Never would have seen that coming. Some other questions that we'll bring up a little bit later in the program. So there's a lot to cover. And along the way, I'd love to hear from you if you'd like to join the conversation. 1-800-351-1212. Especially as we talk about 9/11, I'd love to hear from some of you what you were doing that day, whether or not you think the 17th anniversary is something we should focus on, or whether we just simply need to move on. Because the argument has always been we will never forget. And certainly we cannot forget if we want to at least use this as an opportunity to focus on what took place. And so I've posted a couple of very good articles on all of this. One, a New York City firefighter, which I'll get to in just a minute, but also one just entitled Remembering 9/11, The Sacrifices Never Stop. Tom Saleo wrote this for The Stream, and he said this morning in Afghanistan, thousands of American warriors woke up in the country where 9/11 was planned. Some were just toddlers on September 11th, 2001. Today marks the 17th anniversary of the worst terrorist attack in American history. While the horrors of that day drift in and out of our national consciousness, the sacrifices it spawned never stopped. It started with heroes like U.S. Army veteran Rick Riscoria, who was in the World Trade Center's South Tower when its twin was struck by the first hijacked plane. Ignoring initial speculation that the crash was an accident, Riscoria, a security officer for Morgan Stanley, ordered all 2,700 employees out. His wife, Susan, said he wasn't thinking about himself after that first plane hit. He did what he did in Vietnam, leave no man behind. After calmly leading almost every Morgan Stanley employee out of the South Tower, even as it was struck by the second hijacked jet, Riscoria ran back inside to save more lives. He was last seen heading upstairs just before the building collapsed. Along with the first responders who ran inside the burning World Trade Center and the Pentagon, as well as the citizens who charged the hijackers on United Flight 93, Riscoria was one of the first heroes of our country's long war on terrorism. Yet when I spoke to Rick's widow, she was equally focused on spotlighting the ongoing burdens being shouldered by the American military. She said, "I never look at Ground Zero as a killing field," Susan said. "It's a place where our country went to war." Indeed, the constant struggle that began 17 years ago continues at this very moment. As of this writing, the loved ones of U.S. Army Commander Sergeant Major Timothy Bulliard, who made the ultimate sacrifice in Afghanistan earlier this month, are preparing to lay the fallen soldier to rest. Command Sergeant Major Bolliard had been serving in the military for 7 years when our country was attacked and would spend the next 17 deploying to more of the world's most dangerous places. When Bolliard was shot and killed on September 3rd, he tragically became one of the almost 7,000 U.S. troops to lose their lives on America's post-9/11 battlefields. As the stream's daily and weekly military features remind us, our valiant men and women in uniform tirelessly work to keep us safe. From deployed service members and their loved ones to wounded veterans, Gold Star families, our nation's military community is a giant chest of national treasures. He says, first and foremost, each 9/11 anniversary is a day to honor the attack's 2,753 victims and their families. It is also a powerful reminder for all that divides us. We are still surrounded by heroes willing to lay down their lives in defense of liberty. He goes on to say that September 11th, 2001 was one of the worst days in our country's history. It was also the moment when a new generation stepped forward to defend freedom. As President George W. Bush said after the attacks, the course of this conflict is not known, yet its outcome is certain. Freedom and fear, justice and cruelty have always been at war, and we know that God is not neutral between them. By the way, I might just mention, I was reading another piece by an individual that I believe at the time was in Sweden. And, Sweden always likes to sort of stay neutral and stay out of conflicts. But it was this particular phrase that actually caused him to get out of his lethargy and to say, my countrymen aren't understanding that we really are in war. The other side declared war on us. We just haven't figured this out. And it was that particular line by George W. Bush, which again, let me repeat it. Freedom and fear, justice and cruelty have always been at war. And yet we know that God is not neutral between them. He said that was the line that caused him to kind of shake out of his lethargy and say, you know what? We need to support those individuals that are fighting to protect us from these terrorists that want to destroy Western culture and destroy our lives. Well, anyway, Tom Saleo continues by saying, some of our nation's defenders are unable to recall the harrowing images of victims falling from the Twin Towers, stretchers being carried from the Pentagon, or smoke rising from a silent Pennsylvania field. Still, just like Rick Riscoria and Command Sergeant Major Timothy Bolliard, these young patriots are willing to sacrifice everything. Their courage is America's greatest blessing. Let me take a break. When we come back, I want to read another one from a New York firefighter, which is also very powerful. But I thought it was interesting that one of the things Tom Cilia talks about here is that we are divided. And the argument that is made is, well, we're divided because of who's in the Oval Office. But I think we were divided before 9/11. We were united. How long did that last? About a week. How many times did we think this might be the beginning of a revival? We started to see all sorts of people in church on that Sunday. We thought, maybe this might be the beginning of a revival. Then the next week, not so many. And pretty soon, we were back to a divided nation once again. One of the questions I want to put on the table for you today, if you'd like to join us, is do you think there's a chance for us to come together again as a nation? Another question on the table is, do you think we've forgotten some of the lessons of 9/11? 17 years ago now, and those of you that are old enough, remember where you were. Some of you youngsters listening to this program probably don't remember it very well, but those of us that were alive in 2001, we remember it. When we come back, I want to read a piece from a New York firefighter. We've posted both of these on the website so that you can read them, maybe post them on your website, maybe even read them to your family. We'll have more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
When voters go to the polls, they need to not only pay attention to congressional races, but also the races for state legislature. Karl Rove refers to this as the other House race. We talked about his commentary recently on Point of View. These days, most people are focusing on the elections of the U.S. House of Representatives. About 60 of the 435 elections will be competitive and ultimately determine whether Republicans or Democrats control the House next year. The other House race is at the state level. Who the voters elect to state legislatures will determine the congressional districts in the next decade. That's why we should also pay attention to the battle over 6,000 contests this fall and another 6,000 races next year and in 2020. Since most state senators serve 4-year terms, those elected this November will be the ones casting votes on congressional redistricting plans. None of this has escaped the notice of political parties. Republicans currently hold 67 of 99 chambers. They control both legislatures in 32 states. By contrast, Democrats have legislative majorities in both houses in 14 states. None of this should escape the notice of voters. Who you vote for in the state legislative races this fall and in the near future will determine who you can elect in Congress a few years from now. Remember that I mentioned that only 60 of the 435 races for the House of Representatives are competitive races. I might add that the number is a bit higher than usual because so many Republican members of Congress decided to resign this election. This is yet another reminder that you really need to pay attention to all the candidates you elect up and down the ballot. It will have an impact on you in the future. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From Universal 1440, Unbroken, Path to Redemption, the rest of World War II hero Louis Zamperini's true story. In theaters September 14th, rated PG-13.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, love to get your comments about the 17th anniversary of 9/11. Where were you then? Do you think we may bring this country back together again, or we continue to be a divided country? There was a time in which there was at least a little bit of unanimity that has certainly evaporated over the years. And most importantly, do you think we've learned any lessons from 9/11? And we're going to spend some time a little bit later talking about some of those issues. Matter of fact, in the next hour, we're going to be talking about this new film, Surrender Only to One. Since 9/11, the United States has been engaged in one of the longest wars in our country's history. And on the anniversary of this day, they have a national premiere. Those of you in Florida will be able to attend it, but of course it will roll out to other places around the country. And this is an opportunity to, in a sense, celebrate Patriot Day with the idea, let us never forget, and it is entitled Surrender Only to One. And one of the many themes, in addition to the incredible service of those of you that have served in the military, as I've said before, we'll never be able to thank you enough for what you've done, is the also concerning issue of whether or not we can do more for those suffering from PTSD. And if you listen to Point of View, as a matter of fact, right now I think we're even playing some of the spots to encourage you to go to Unbroken. I've had a chance to see that film, and in some respects, the Angelina Jolie film before was very gripping, powerful, maybe even a little too gruesome, but it really sort of ended in a truncated way because, to me, one of the most significant parts of that story for Louis Zamperini was not that he was an Olympic athlete, though he was, not that he was a POW, which he was, but what happened when he came home and descending into alcoholism, what today we call PTSD. They didn't really have the same name for it back then. And just having these incredible nightmares from his POW experience, where later in the film they mentioned that 85% of those who were POWs in the Pacific Theater struggled with this problem. But then to go to a Billy Graham crusade and to walk forward, give his life, and instantaneously be miraculously healed. I recognize that many individuals that commit their lives to Jesus Christ still struggle with alcoholism. He never drank again. I know some that have struggled with PTSD, even if they, pray diligently and have people lay hands on them and everything else, still struggle with that. But he never had another one of those nightmares as far as I understand. And so anyway, it's a powerful film, which I think also is very appropriate right now when we are talking about 9/11. Well, let me go to this piece before we run out of time. This one is written by Tim Sullivan. He's a New York firefighter, but I thought it was really good because it pulls together the incidents, of course, what happened on September 11th, 2001, and then what happened afterwards, and then a chance meeting that later meant something to him. So if you would like to read it, it's our first article that we've posted on our website, pointofview.net, Tim Sullivan. So you can find it also at Fox News commentary. And it's entitled New York City Firefighter, How September 11th, a Day of Tragedy, Can Be a Day of Inspiration 17 years later. Starts out with this. Tim, get to work, my brother solemnly said over the phone. It's going to get worse. I'd received the call just as the first tower was struck, and we didn't know all that was yet to come. Like so many other Americans on September 11th, 2001, I had simply been getting ready for another day, eating breakfast and reading the newspaper. As I jumped in the car and began driving downtown as fast as possible, I called my wife, Colleen, who was 8.5 months pregnant with our first child. I let her know that something was happening in Manhattan. I needed to be there, and I didn't know when I'd be home again. Next, I called my buddy Jeff, who was my wife and I had asked to be the godfather of my unborn child. I told him, too, that I was headed into the city and added that I had a bad feeling firemen were going to lose their lives. If something would happen to me, he would have to care for Colleen and his godchild. Wow. By the time I arrived on the scene, the North Tower had already collapsed. Over the next several days, we started the work of putting New York City back together. This year, on the anniversary of September 11th, 2001, I will concentrate on the words, if not me, then who? And hope others will, too, consider this call to action that exudes America's national character. I'm going to get back to that comment that he makes, and you'll understand why in just a minute. But again, Tim Sullivan continues on to say that years later, I was stationed at Rescue Company Number 1 in Midtown Manhattan, which had lost 11 men on September 11, 2001. I was humbled to be one of several firefighters who would help continue their legacy. With visitors to the station, I was always eager to relay acts of bravery by everyday people in that fateful moment. They remain emblematic of our country's resilience, as well as a fundamental testament to our character. So when 2 Marines knocked on our door one evening in late 2006, as a former Marine myself, I was especially enthusiastic about swapping stories. One of them, a Marine first lieutenant, reflected on the deployment he had just returned from and spoke passionately about the challenges that awaited him in several weeks on his next deployment. He truly believed in his mission, and he was certain he was the right man for the job. I admired his resolve. I wished him luck and sent him off with a few hats and T-shirts. 8 years later, in December 2014, a friend and fellow firefighter handed me a book, Brothers Forever. It's the account of 2 best friends and Naval Academy roommates who went on to become a Marine and a Navy SEAL. Both gave their lives in service and are now buried side by side in Arlington National Cemetery. I was so compelled, I tore through it, but midway through, I was stopped immediately in my tracks. I read about how before the last deployment, the young Marine made a trip to New York City to visit Rescue Company Number 1. He recounted spending time with a firefighter and, after sharing stories, having been reminded of why he was soon being deployed to Iraq. The Marine also mentioned that he had returned with a hat for his father, a memento to remember him while overseas. In that moment, I realized the Marine I had spoken with in 2006 was First Lieutenant Travis Manion, the subject of the book and a hero who had gone off to Iraq to never return home. I learned that during the ambush in which he was killed by sniper fire, he drew fire away from his 2 wounded teammates, allowing them to be rescued. For this, Travis was awarded the Silver Star and the Bronze Star with Valor. I immediately reached out to Travis Manion Foundation, the organization that now bears that Marine's name. I was taken by their commitment to supporting veterans and families of the fallen and ensuring that the strength of character these men and women demonstrated and continue to demonstrate lives on in succeeding generations of Americans. Scrolling through the organization's website, I stumbled upon the foundation's motto, "If not me, then who?" Those 5 words were Travis's response to a family member who had joked that if Travis were to break his leg, he wouldn't have to return to Iraq. Reading them took me back to my frantic 100-mile-per-hour drive into Manhattan on September 11th and the sense of duty that kept me and my colleagues and fellow citizens strong in the following days, weeks, months, and years. It also took me back to that evening in late 2006 when I met Travis. And though I had not ever caught his name, I knew that he was driven by a sense of duty to country. Since then, I've been honored to be part of the Travis Manion Foundation alongside other volunteers who've posed Travis' question to themselves. Today, our country seems divided more than ever, but as I look back on how great a nation united together 17 years ago in the face of adversity, my hope is that we can rekindle the support and care for one another that seems to have faded. This year, on the anniversary of September 11th, 2001, I will concentrate on the words, "If not me, then who?" and hope others, too, will consider this call to action, which excludes America's national character. And by doing so, I pray that we will remember the heroes we've lost, and just as importantly, that we will find the strength to live and defend what they stood for. Tim Sullivan, a lieutenant with the Fire Department of the New York City Special Operations Command. If nothing else, a really important question. If not me, then who? We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
There is no more dangerous time than when things are going well. Remember Elijah on Mount Carmel? Fire came down. There was no doubt who was God, but what happened next? He went from amazing faith to a time of great fear and depression. Many Christians have been very thankful a certain Democratic candidate for president was not the one to nominate 2 replacements for the Supreme Court. But as with Elijah, times of great victory are also times of great danger. Moments like this are not the time to take it easy. This is not the time to let our guard down. This is a time to double down on our work in the community, to serve and pray and plan and invest in a better future. This is the time to join Point of View's Truth Team 360 to make sure today's promising gains are not lost tomorrow. Show your commitment to our future by visiting pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Ask to join the Truth Team. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, we've been reflecting over this last half hour and even earlier than that about the last 17 years, what happened 17 years ago. And so, if nothing else, we wanted to give you a chance to now maybe look back 100 years, because some very unique things were taking place in September of 1918, 100 years ago. And you can find that in a book that is just coming out now called September 1918, War, Plague, and the World Series. And the author joins us now by phone for a few minutes, and that is Skip Desjardin, who is a 30-year veteran of the media, has had experience as a journalist, an on-air television anchor, producer, programming executive, and as an individual that has worked as well as an executive at Google, building an influential YouTube TV and Google Fiber Internet projects, a graduate of the University of Notre Dame, and joins us now by phone from West Hartford, Connecticut. Skip, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Kerby, thank you for having me.
Let's see if we can get into some of this history, and each one is fascinating. The plague, if people are not familiar, is the Spanish flu, the greatest pandemic. The war, I think people will understand as well, but maybe we'll start with the fun one first, since everybody around the table here loves baseball, and that is the World Series, being led by a young pitcher by the name of Babe Ruth. Tell us, first of all, a little bit more about kind of the context of what was happening there in Boston at the time.
Well, today is the 100th anniversary of the Red Sox winning that 1918 World Series. And for me, as a New England native and somebody who's a lifelong Red Sox fan, it is the only silver lining each year on September 11th now.
Yes, well, and it took 86 years to get it again, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, I used to live in Connecticut, so I can relate only so well.
Well, it's part of what prompted me to write this book, is that I had stumbled across this notion that the World Series was held in September of that year. And it piqued my curiosity. Why? Why was the World Series held in September? And it was a result of the war. The government had issued what became known as the Work or Fight Order.
Right.
And it said that every man in America between the ages of 18 and 30 had three choices: enlist, make themselves eligible for the draft, or get a job that was directly related to the war effort. That left baseball in kind of a tough spot. Were baseball players exempt from that rule? Could the case be made that entertainment was good for civilian morale and therefore they were playing their part in the war effort? The government decided no. These guys were healthy and of age, and they should be doing their part more than playing baseball. So the season was shortened. It ended on Labor Day, and the Red Sox and the Cubs were allowed to play 2 more weeks to get the World Series played. And in addition to the question of why was the World Series played in September, young Babe Ruth really fascinated me. We all think of him as that fat, pigeon-toed guy running around the bases in fast motion in the old newsreels. But this was 24-year-old Babe Ruth in the prime of his career, at once the best pitcher in baseball and the best hitter in baseball. And it's taken us 100 years, and we're right back around to that point where we now have somebody who is both a pitcher and a hitter in Shohei Ohtani of the Los Angeles Angels. But in the intervening years, that had not happened.
And again, just a phenomenal set of circumstances there as well. I might just mention this is published by Regnery, and you should be able to find it in your local bookstore, but we do have a link so that you could get it there as well. And I think you really would enjoy reading some of the history. It's available both in hardcover and Kindle. And let's, if we can, talk about some of the other aspects, because obviously the World Series was shortened. And, of course, Babe Ruth was the hero and a pitcher at the time. I always love the story about that. But one of the other things that you talk about is the plague. And we, I think, have no idea, unless you've read your history, how devastating the Spanish flu was, which, again, since we're in Boston, let's just keep it in Boston here, erupted in Boston, in its suburbs, bringing death to untold numbers. that had never experienced anything like that before.
No, it's the worst epidemic in world history. Estimates are on the low side because it was hard to keep records in those days, especially in far-flung places around the globe. But the best estimates now are that over 100 million people died of the Spanish flu.
Wow.
In the United States, that number was almost 700,000. And in Boston and Massachusetts, where it began here in the States, to give you some perspective, last year in Massachusetts, a particularly severe flu season, about 5,000 people got sick. In 1918, in the month of September, 5,000 people died of the flu. And at one point in the third week of September, 85,000 people were sick. It was all-consuming in Boston and Massachusetts during that month. And that, too, was part of the reason that I wrote this book, at least my initial curiosity, the idea that, wait a minute, they're playing a World Series in Boston at the same time that this deadly epidemic is going on. What in the world would possess people to go out to Fenway Park and to cram into that old ballpark side by side with a bunch of other people at exactly the time that doing so could kill you? And what I found out in my research was that in the early part of September, and today's the 100th anniversary, so the World Series ended by the 11th of the month, not many people knew the extent of the epidemic. It was present, it was getting rolling, it was affecting a lot of people, but the war had an effect on that as well. We also forget in our history studies that during World War I, it was illegal in America to publish material that either criticized the president or criticized the government or was considered unpatriotic or was considered bad for morale. And what story can you think of that would be worse for morale than to tell people that hundreds of people in their community are dying? And so the newspapers, and there were 8 daily newspapers in Boston at the time, kind of stayed away from this story. They were unsure. You know, there were editors going to jail around America for the things that they printed, and they were afraid to sort of cover this story in its entirety, which was tragic in and of itself. These laws were very well intended, and the United States needed to be on an absolute total war footing because when Congress declared war in 1917, we didn't even have a standing army. And so every aspect of America had to be turned towards fighting and winning this war. The unforeseen consequence, though, was that way more people died of the flu, not just in Boston, but the cities that came after it, because the full story wasn't being told. People weren't being instructed how to protect themselves, all in the name, the well-intentioned name of good public morale.
Just incredible. Book is entitled War, Plague, and the World Series. And just another aspect of that, Skip, is the fact that these individuals that were contracting the disease sometimes were citizens who then went into the military, spread it in the military. So because you were mobilizing individuals, mobilizing troops, sending some overseas, sending others to camps being trained, it took a problem that was already significant and seemingly made it worse.
Yeah, it was at its worst early on in 2 places, the Naval Yard in Boston Harbor and an Army camp just west of Boston, which makes sense. That's where men were packed in tight quarters and bumping up against each other and sharing the air and spreading the germs. But because so many people came and went from those facilities, it quickly spread to the civilian population. And because the war was going on and troops and sailors were moving, Boston was literally exporting Spanish flu to other cities. As troop ships sailed to other cities, as trains left Boston and sent men to other camps around the country, that's what really caused the epidemic to spread. And it went first to other military facilities around the country, and then the process repeated itself. As those civilians interacted with those soldiers and sailors, it spread out into the civilian population, which is why by the time it was done, there were very few places in America that were untouched, and almost 700,000 people died. Unlike today's flu, which, by the way, is still the fourth or fifth biggest killer of Americans in terms of disease every year, even after 100 years of medical advances. It killed the most healthy. Today, we tend to think that infants and the elderly are the most susceptible to the flu. This particular strain, and why it killed so many people around the world, attacked the most healthy people. It got into their lungs, and their own antibodies and their own
immune system,
disease
actually accentuated.
Yeah.
Let's take a break. We've got a lot more to cover. The book is entitled War, Plague, and the World Series. Skip with us right after these important messages.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. A federal court in Oklahoma has ruled that despite the religious ardor of some of its adherents, environmentalism is not a religion. Randall Krause filed a lawsuit against the Tulsa County Library Commission. Evidently, the commission maintains a recycling program, and according to Krause, it constitutes an undue burden on the free exercise of his environmentalism. Krause alleged that the commission had placed fake recycling bins throughout town, victimizing him and other adherents to environmentalism. Well, the judge didn't buy the argument. Dismissing the case, the court explained that Krause had failed to establish that his environmentalism was anything more than personal preferences and secular beliefs without foundation in any religion. And even if it were, the fake recycling bins placed around town did not amount to a coercive law meriting protection by the First Amendment. Determining what is a religion is difficult for any court, but as the Supreme Court has explained, religious beliefs need not be acceptable, logical, consistent, or comprehensible to others in order to merit First Amendment protection. But the court does require beliefs to be rooted in a religion in order to trigger protection under the religion clauses of the First Amendment. For now, at least in Tulsa, environmentalism does not constitute a valid religion, but it leaves me with one nagging question. Is a fake recycling bin just a trash can? To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
You know, every once in a while, I bet you wonder, what was it like 100 years ago? Well, this book really helps you understand what it was like, at least in Boston, in 1918, War, Plague, and the World Series. Skip Desjardin is with us. And Skip, one of the things I appreciate about this book and others like it is it reminds me that there were a lot of contemporaries at the same time. Of course, we've talked about the World Series, a little bit about the Spanish flu, but also at the same time, you bring in people like Calvin Coolidge, World War I ace, the poet E.E. Cummings, for those of us that love football, Curly Lambeau and George Gipp and Newt Rockne, and for those of us that love politics, Henry Cabot Lodge. All of this is happening kind of simultaneously, and we only have a few minutes left, but let me give you the floor just to kind of put some of those pieces together, because it's a fascinating mosaic of all sorts of individuals and activities happening simultaneously.
Yeah, as I did the research and found all of these stories and found how so many of the great moments in history were related at that particular time to Boston and Massachusetts, that's when I really knew I had stumbled onto something. And as you said, here was E.E. Cummings, a private in the Army, but at Camp Devens, the epicenter of the Spanish flu epidemic, just trying to survive. Here was Calvin Coolidge, who was the lieutenant governor of Massachusetts at the time, but the governor was on vacation and not inclined to come home and handle the greatest public health crisis the country had ever known. John Singer Sargent, the famous painter, was with Massachusetts troops on the front in France looking for a subject to paint, and the result was one of his more famous paintings, a painting called Ghast, which hangs in the British Museum in London now. All of these people were popping up in this 30-day period, all related to the events that were taking place. Another was Maud Wood Park, the Boston suffragist leader who almost single-handedly drove the 19th Amendment to the Constitution and the women's right to vote to a major vote on the 30th of September, almost all by herself, as a person who didn't have the right to vote herself and still was having a tremendous effect on electoral politics.
So again, just lots of things happening all simultaneously. I'm glad you brought up the one about right to vote, because again, 100 years ago, women didn't have the right to vote. Let's get back to the war for just a minute, because I think that this is something which most Americans don't know a lot about, because we had the war to end all wars. Then we ended up having World War II, and I think a lot of people have forgotten about how horrific World War I was. I've, over the last couple of years, taken some time to watch some YouTube videos and sometimes watch some TED Talks on World War I to realize this is trench warfare where people are having PTSD, although they didn't call it back then that. Poisonous gas, it just devastated especially the ranks of the gentleman class in England and other places. And this was something which the United States up until then had been able to stay out of. But now, of course, we're sending our best and our brightest troops over to fight in those trenches once again.
Yeah, and the Battle of St. Mihiel, which took place on the 12th of September, was a key turning point in that war. And again, it was a Massachusetts regiment that ended up winning that battle. There was a piece of land that France and Germany had been fighting over for 4 years, back and forth.
Yes.
And for the first time, an all-American army was on the field under the charge of blackjack Pershing.
Mm-hmm.
And the French sent these American troops out to say, well, let's see what you got. See if you can go get that piece of land. And they grabbed it in under 12 hours and held it. And it broke the will of not only the German troops, but the German command. After all these years of attrition, and as you said, all of these deaths on the front, suddenly there was a brand new, powerful, fresh army of more than 1 million men, and they were going to have to contend with that. And it was just 6 weeks after September 1918 ended that the war did as well.
You know, one other thing that comes from these books is when you go back 100 years, you think, well, they were in the modern era. Not really. I mean, whether you're thinking about flush toilets, whether you're thinking about antibiotics or penicillin, all, none of that existed. And so in some respects, even in 1918, they had more in common with people in the 18th and 19th century than they had in common with people in the latter part of the 20th century, don't you think?
I absolutely do. That's certainly the case in terms of medicine. And even in warfare, this was the first war in which airplanes were involved.
Right.
1918 is just 15 years after the Wright brothers. And yet, suddenly, in that short a period of time, airplanes are playing a key role. And one of the heroic stories in the book is of David Putnam,
right,
who was America's ace of aces. He'd shot down more Germans than any other American in the war. He was famous all over America, and his exploits were written up in newspapers all across the country. And in that Battle of St. Mihiel on September 12th, he died at the age of 19, which is not so different from today, I suppose, in the average age of our soldiers, but just as heroic a story as you will hear in any of the annals of American military history.
Again, a flying ace, one of the few American aces. Of course, Germany's best known for the Red Baron and some of the others, which I've, of course, read about and seen some of the various lectures on. But just a fascinating book. Just before we let you go, Skip, talk about how people can use this book, because I know that those of us that love history, and we do talk about history quite often here on Point of View, will appreciate this. But it seems to me that this might be something that some of our teachers listening in right now and homeschool parents and others might use to really begin to teach a little bit more about that part of American history that a lot of people simply don't know very much about.
I think that's a great point, because it does cover war and politics and the situation on the home front. And there are stories in there of the way school children were playing their role in the war effort even. And you're right, we do have a tendency to go from the Pilgrims to George Washington to the Civil War to World War II, and that's sort of the greatest hits of American history that are taught these days. And this particular chapter is one that often gets skipped over.
Well, again, I think you've done a great job of pulling it together. 300-plus pages, Regnery History. You should be able to find it in your local bookstore if you go in there, look in the history section. But if not, we have a link so that you can get it either in hardcover or Kindle. And, Skip, I appreciate you writing it, and thank you for giving us some time here on Point of View to talk about what happened 100 years ago.
Thank you for having me on, Kirby. I really enjoyed it.
We are going to come back and get into a movie that you will need to know about on Patriot Day, which actually is having a premiere tonight. So we're going to be talking about that idea of PTSD, and some of that will be part and parcel of that. But again, if you wanted some of the material that we've talked about today, let me mention that, of course, we went back to 17 years ago, and I thought there would be two very good articles that you would find helpful. One, which I read earlier, that is entitled The New York City Firefighter, and I think that was a very powerful piece indeed, pulling together not only what happened on that day, but what happened since then, and if not you, then who? And then also one on remembering 9/11, a good piece that appeared in the stream. We also have a link, of course, to this book, War, Plague, and the World Series. So instead of just going back 17 years, we thought it might be interesting to go back 100 years. And because we find ourselves here September 11th, 2018, what was it like September 11th, 1918? And I just wanted to give you a little bit of a flavor of what's in that book. And when we come back, we're going to be talking about then this movie, Surrender Only to One, a very important piece, because really since September 11th, 2001, we've been engaged in the longest war in our history. And on this anniversary, there was a desire to have a premiere to this movie. It's a docudrama, and it will be taking place tonight in Florida. So those of you that are in the Tampa area can perhaps watch it, but it will be rolled out to others as well. And there's all sorts of other information about that, which I thought would be helpful. And it's a way in which we can salute those of you in the military and also focus very important attention on PTSD, which is something we'll talk about when we come back in the next hour. Then we'll get back into the news. There's a lot taking place, so we will certainly then transition to some news items. So take the time to visit the website, pointofview.net. Stay tuned. We'll have more right after this.
From Universal 1440 comes Unbroken, Path to Redemption. Based on the best-selling book telling the rest of the true story of Olympian and World War II hero Louis Zamperini.
Tonight, there's a drowning man just looking for some type of hope for the future. But there's a lifeline. Just reach out.
Unbroken, Path to Redemption. Rated PG-13. May be inappropriate for children under 13. In theaters September 14th. More information is available at unbrokenfilm.com.
You don't become an Olympian without investing all you've got. You don't become a war hero without putting it all on the line. Those who leave a mark on this world demonstrate they believe in something greater than themselves, a purpose, a cause. In a time of fake news, the need for solid information is perhaps greater than ever. Bring truth to the nation by joining the Truth Team at Point of View. Our cause needs heroes like you. Demonstrate what you believe. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
On this Patriot Day, 17 years after 9/11, we certainly want to salute those of you in the military, but also focus some time and attention on PTSD. You perhaps have seen some of the statistics. Every 65 minutes, one of these heroes kills himself or herself, and we want to really take some time to address that issue, but also to tell you about a film. We talk so often on this program about films that we believe can make a difference, and this is a faith-based film we want you to know more about. In order to explain what is taking place here, we bring to the microphone Lieutenant Colonel Damon Friedman. He and his wife Dana established what is called the Shield of Faith Missions, and he is also the executive producer of Surrender Only to One. We have the trailer for that film on our website right now. It's a faith-based film, and one of the things I would encourage you to do is watch the trailer. It's about 2 minutes long. Then click that share button. Put it on your Facebook page. Put it on a Twitter feed, or send it to someone that might benefit from that as well. We'll talk more about that in just a minute. Damon Friedman received his commission in 2000 as an officer in the Marine Corps. After 5 years, transferred to the Air Force Special Ops, served 4 combat deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan, won 3 Bronze Stars Air Force Combat Action Medal. In April of 2010, earned the Bronze Star with Valor for his role in the Special Tactics Officer directing air support. And again, you can read all about just an incredible story there. Individual that has earned master's degrees from the University of Oklahoma, from Liberty University, and a doctorate from Fuller Theological Seminary. Colonel Friedman, it is a delight to have you on the program with us today here on Point of View.
Well, brother, thank you so much for having me. I feel it's just really an honor to be here, and just grateful to be able to share this critical message to all of the Americans out there, to let them know what's happening with our warriors and what we can do as a team to help solve their issues, provide solutions so that we can help out our American heroes, men and women who've gone out into the front lines and have fought so brave for our freedom. So I appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, again, we celebrate and salute all of you in the military. We'll never be able to thank you enough, but we also recognize what an incredibly difficult situation this has become, with the number of warriors that have come back and fall into alcoholism, fall into homelessness, eventually kill themselves. And so that, I think, brings me to, why did you and your wife Dana establish the Shield of Faith Missions, and what does that entail?
Well, a lot of it just has to do with my own personal journey. So back in 2010, I was dealing with some serious issues, coming back from war, multiple deployments, experienced lots of concussions. And, you know, each and every warrior, they process combat, differently. We're all very unique, not the same. And for me at that time, I was dealing with some dark issues. I was on the verge of getting a divorce. And I'd even made some bad decisions in my career. And I just came up with this question that was a radical question. It was like, well, what's my purpose? And I wasn't able to answer that. But my next question was, well, what's my purpose to even live? So I was going through some dark times, and then through that process, we had some really good friends, people that loved me and cared for me and helped me get on this journey of healing. And so this process was like God providing all these individuals, healthcare professionals, good friends, physical rehab. I mean, I ended up going through all this and received all these resources. And I found myself about a year and a half later back on my feet, filled with hope. Psychologically, I was in a healthy state. Physically, I've gone through some of the best physical rehabilitation, that this country can offer. And spiritually, man, I'll tell you what, the commander of the universe gave me hope. He gave me purpose, and I was now on a mission. So I had been serving my country, conducting the nation's bidding for approximately 10 years, but now I had a new mission. As I served my country, now I was going to serve the kingdom. And then my wife and I were like, wow, can you believe what has happened? What would it look like if we were able to establish a nonprofit where we could provide the same help, the same hope to all of our other veterans, psychological, physical, and spiritual? And then boom, it was the birth of SOF Missions, which is Shield of Faith Missions. And now you fast forward to 2018, right? And we've served over 65,000 people globally. Thousands of veterans have been empowered, and we've provided intensive care, psychological, physical, spiritual, to a lot of veterans and helping them just get on a path of wellness. And God has just been so good to us. We want to bless the nation. We want to bless our veterans. And so we're really excited about what SOF Missions can do for our veteran community.
Again, it's SOF Missions, softmissions.com, and we have a link to it on our website. If you are in the military, know somebody that is, certainly I want you to go to sofmissions.com. You're going to find, first of all, there's a place where you can get help, give hope, get involved. There's actually an SOF Academy, stands again for Shield of Faith Academy, that has a collection of online mission resources and resources that are available. And I just think that you and your wife, Damon, have done such a great job of ministering to sometimes a forgotten sector of our society. It's not that people don't appreciate the military. Again, in any airport, somebody gets off the plane and they have a uniform on. Everybody's saying, thank you for your service and everything else. But then when they go back home, then they feel like nobody cares about them, and they're dealing with really immense psychological and spiritual issues. So I am just thrilled that there is such a group like the Shield of Faith Missions. And let's mention one more, because it's Patriot Day today. Let us never forget.
That's right.
And you're having a premiere of the film. And I just mentioned, again, the trailer. It's almost 3 minutes long, so I will say maybe 3 minutes to watch. And then I encourage you to click that share button and put that trailer on there, because it'll help you understand why it's important. But for people that live, say, in Florida, especially in Tampa, you got a premiere coming tonight, don't you?
Absolutely, and we're really ecstatic because we showed this film in a pre-release out in California, and over 25,000 people were able to watch it live. And we're excited because now we finally got this, and we're launching this nationally. And so at the Tampa Theater, doors open at 7 o'clock, but check this out. Not everybody out there is going to be able to be at Tampa Theater. We got over 1,000 seats. We're almost filled. So for people that haven't gotten their RSVP, go to sofmissions.com, click on RSVP. But check this out. What if you can't be in Tampa? Well, we are actually making it available to host your own simulcast. Go to the same website, sofmissions.com, click register and host your own. We've got hundreds of churches, nonprofits, organizations, even small groups hosting their own simulcast starting tonight throughout this whole week. And they could just do it. It'll be awesome. And it's a 90-minute venue. We've got our award-winning film. We've received 6 national and international film festival awards. And we also have, this is a surprise, but we've got legendary Bobby Bowden, FSU coach, who's the most winningest coach in NCAA history, multiple championships. We've got General McChrystal, commander of all U.S. forces, former commander, known best for his work at JSOC. And then last but not least, we partnered with Unbroken. We've got Luke Zamperini, who's part of our interviews as well. So we're excited about this film tonight.
Going to take a break, continue our conversation right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
When voters go to the polls, they need to not only pay attention to congressional races, but also the races for state legislature. Karl Rove refers to this as the other House race. We talked about his commentary recently on Point of View. These days, most people are focusing on the elections of the U.S. House of Representatives. About 60 of the 435 elections will be competitive and ultimately determine whether Republicans or Democrats control the House next year. The other House race is at the state level. Who the voters elect to state legislatures will determine the congressional districts in the next decade. That's why we should also pay attention to the battle over 6,000 contests this fall and another 6,000 races next year and in 2020. Since most state senators serve 4-year terms, those elected this November will be the ones casting votes on congressional redistricting plans. None of this has escaped the notice of political parties. Republicans currently hold 67 of 99 chambers. They control both legislatures in 32 states. By contrast, Democrats have legislative majorities in both houses in 14 states. None of this should escape the notice of voters. Who you vote for in the state legislative races this fall and in the near future will determine who you can elect in Congress a few years from now. Remember that I mentioned that only 60 of the 435 races for the House of Representatives are competitive races. I might add that the number is a bit higher than usual because so many Republican members of Congress decided to resign this election. This is yet another reminder that you really need to pay attention to all the candidates you elect up and down the ballot. It will have an impact on you in the future. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From Universal 1440, Unbroken, Path to Redemption, the rest of World War II hero Louis Zamperini's true story. In theaters September 14th, rated PG-13.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Colonel Damon Friedman with us, and if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Wanted to give some of you a chance to maybe share your story, and maybe there has been an opportunity for you to get some treatment, some healing, if you've gone through PTSD or if you know someone who has. And again, those of you that have served in the military, we want to say thank you to you. And on this special Patriots Day, and also at a time when there is going to be this premiere of this new film, it's an award-winning film, Surrender Only to One, takes place tonight for those of you in Florida. But the good news is you can go to the website, sofmissions.com. Left-hand side there is a place where you can still RSVP for a seat. But I know that since we broadcast in over 40 states around the country, most of you cannot make it there. So on the right-hand side, there's a place where you can actually host a simulcast. This could be an opportunity for you to have something for military families. It's something you could provide in your church or those kinds of activities. And one of the things, Damon, that you mentioned just a minute ago is that you are linking arms with an organization we've been working with the last week or so. We've had Luke Zamperini on the program. We've all been to the movie already, Unbroken, the incredible story of Louis Zamperini, who, after being an Olympic champion, being a POW, comes back and devolves into and sinks to alcoholism and deals with all sorts of nightmares, which today we call PTSD. We didn't really have a name for it back then, but an incredible victory that he receives by going to the Billy Graham Crusade. And I'm just thrilled to know that you're working with Luke Zamperini on these projects as well, because the two really go hand in hand, don't they?
Absolutely, and we're really honored because we're providing resources for Unbroken. And I'll tell you what, Luke was a champ. He knows exactly to communicate the issues that his dad had, but then even more importantly, the solution to the issues that he was dealing with, which is a perfect segue in talking about we have 6 operators in this film, surrender only to one, military elite, and we even have 1 female, because even today, 2.7 million men and women have deployed to Afghanistan and Iraq, and there's a significant population of women going to combat. Well, we've got these stories. They're talking about the implications of combat, just like Zamperini had experienced, some a little bit more severe than others, and they start coming home. They deal with post-traumatic stress, the disorder, traumatic brain injury known as TBI, feeling isolated, feeling insignificant, dealing with addiction, dealing with alcoholism, dealing with abuse, marital strife, you name it, but then how ultimately each and every warrior here, no matter how bad it is, no matter how bad it gets, even to the point, one of them talks about his point of almost committing suicide, literally gun in hand, round in chamber, ready to pull the trigger until all of a sudden God conducts the ultimate quick reaction force and saves him, extracting him out of the kill zone. It's an awesome message. Surrender only to one. Very similar to Zamperini, each and every warrior finds hope in Jesus, the commander of the universe, and we are so stoked just to partner with them and be able to bring the message of Jesus to a lost and broken world.
Explain the idea of surrender, because we know that the macho man, the warrior, says, I'm surrendering to no one, and surrender oftentimes is weakness, but actually surrender is strength, isn't it?
I love that you just asked that question, because here's the deal. I'm in special operations. All my brothers and sisters within the military, surrender is not in our vocabulary. But here's the deal. Each and every warrior, when you are a Spartan, you kneel to a Spartan king. When you are a soldier, you sign on the bottom line, you take an oath to the United States, you follow a general. Each and every warrior, each and every one of us must surrender, but only to one, the King of Kings, the Commander of Commanders, the Lord of Lords, and that's Jesus Christ. And I'm telling you right now, a lot of warriors are out there, and they're broken. And you know what? They're looking for someone worthy to follow, someone with honor, integrity, courageous and bold. And when they find out who Jesus really is, that he exudes all boldness and strength, and that he is one that brings hope and wholeness in these people's worlds, man, I'm telling you right now, they follow the commander, Jesus Christ. It's awesome.
Again, we have information about sofmissions.com, and again, there are some great resources there. As we mentioned before, 20 veterans commit suicide every day, or one every 65 minutes. So just an incredibly tragic set of circumstances, and the reason why this particular ministry, Shield of Faith Missions, exists to really support warriors who struggle with post-traumatic stress and really provide them with the tools necessary to overcome some of the negative impacts of combat. Just before we go any further, I did mention, of course, Louis Zamperini, and I thought, what an, if you will, a comparison to you, because I know in college you ran the 800 meters. You were a junior Olympian. It does seem to me that when you first watched the first film with that was done by Angelina Jolie, and now, of course, the most recent one that's also brought in the spiritual aspect, there were some aspects of Louis Zamperini's life that parallel your life, don't they?
You know, that's true. I would never compare myself, to Zamperini. I believe he was an Olympian, and it was definitely my dream. And at the end of the day, I decided to go into the elite special operations. But running has always been a passion of mine, and I'll tell you, every time he ran, my heart was running with him. But I think that what we both have in common is that we're both running a race, and we're both running for a prize.
Well said.
And if I could just share just one last thing here for all of our listeners out there, is saying, if you're out there and you're hurting and you're broken and you're looking for a solution, man, I'll tell you, SOF Missions does a lot more than just create awareness through this film. I hope you get to see it tonight, but we also provide support groups. We provide educational materials, spiritual growth. And for all the churches out there, we help you guys with your veteran community. We're excited to help you, and we're grateful for this opportunity to be here. And so we're hoping this is the atomic bomb, watching the film Surrender Only to One.
Very good. Just before I let you go, let's talk about the resources. I've already mentioned them once, and of course you have an opportunity for people to give hope, to get help, to get involved. You have the Academy. Talk about what opportunities exist for people to maybe schedule you as a speaker, because I've seen on your upcoming event some of the speaking engagements you've had, and so they might appreciate clicking on your website, but they might say, boy, this guy... I'd love to get Colonel Damon Friedman from front of my guys, because I think they would really motivate them, and he would be a great individual for a men's retreat, great individual for an outreach to the military. What's available, and how can people contact you?
Well, thank you very much for that. All they have to do is go to sofmissions.com. They just click About Us, and then they'll see my bio page there. Just click on it. And if they want to book me, then they just go ahead. They click that, and it'll go out to our team. I've had the honor to speak all over the country, California, Texas, Virginia, Florida. And so we're really excited about being able to share this message and whoever's out there, and I'm just a click away. So I greatly appreciate it.
Well, again, I wanted to thank you, Damon, and I wish you the best tonight. Going to be the national premiere of the award-winning film Surrender Only to One. You can find out more at the website, and thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
God bless you. Thank you, brother. Take care.
Again, I hope you'll check out that opportunity. One, of course, is the opportunity to actually attend the premiere, but I recognize that virtually all of you are too far away to do so. So here is my suggestion. Number one, watch the trailer. It's almost 3 minutes long, and so that will give you a chance to get a sense of what is actually covered in the film. You might want to schedule a simulcast. Of course, they wanted to do that tonight, but that may be too quick for you, but you can do it later in the week or next week or whenever it works for you. And so there's some opportunities for you to connect up and to get that and to use that effectively. If you have people in the military, in your sphere of influence. They may be people in your company, might be people in your neighborhood, might be people in your family. Most importantly, it might be various people that are in the military in your church, some who've returned home, some that you can look at them and they kind of paste a smile on their face when they come to church or when they meet you, but you can kind of see in their eyes that something isn't quite right and they really need some help. Lots of times we say, well, what do we do? Well, we maybe suggest that they go to the VA. We know of individuals that have taken their lives before they were ever able to get an appointment at the VA, as much as that might be helpful to them. And lots of times some of these problems are of a spiritual nature, so that's why I wanted you to know about this organization, Shield of Faith Missions, which is certainly a faith-based organization, and also to promote this film, Surrender Only to One, which is a faith-based film, which really documents some of the true stories of some of these elite warriors, and just to give you an opportunity to see what you can do to reach out to those with very significant needs. So let's take a break. When we come back, I want to wind down the program today with some other issues in the news, so we'll look at those, and then we'll be done for the day. But we'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
There is no more dangerous time than when things are going well. Remember Elijah on Mount Carmel? Fire came down. There was no doubt who was God, but what happened next? He went from amazing faith to a time of great fear and depression. Many Christians have been very thankful a certain Democratic candidate for president was not the one to nominate two replacements for the Supreme Court. But as with Elijah, times of great victory are also times of great danger. Moments like this are not the time to take it easy. This is not the time to let our guard down. This is a time to double down on our work in the community, to serve and pray and plan and invest in a better future. This is the time to join Point of View's Truth Team 360 to make sure today's promising gains are not lost tomorrow. Show your commitment to our future by visiting pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Ask to join the Truth Team. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Last half hour, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. We spent some time looking back over 17 years and what happened on 9/11/2001. We also went back 100 years to what happened in September of 1918. And then, of course, we've also looked at this issue of PTSD and the need for us to reach out to those. So just before the day winds down, I wanted to say a little bit about some of these very important elections that are happening around the country and to look at one anomaly that certainly has caught a lot of people off guard, and that was the fact that Ted Cruz, who's been on this program with us before, is in kind of the battle for his life. And you can begin to recognize how that has changed kind of the Republican strategy. Just a few minutes, I also want to talk about whether or not Donald Trump is going to come to Texas, which it looks like he is, where former President Barack Obama is going to come, and also what I, in my commentary today, call the other House race. So we'll get into that, and then a little bit later, I want to talk a little bit about role models, so we'll get into that as well. But one of the things that's so striking is because this has become such a close race right now between Senator Ted Cruz and Representative Robert O'Rourke, or sometimes people call him Beto O'Rourke, is that this has caused a lot of people to call on the president maybe to come down to Texas to have a rally. Now, the assumption used to be that the Ted Cruz race was going to be a gimme. It wasn't going to be anything that anybody would have to even worry about. That has changed rather dramatically. And so this particular article I have in front of me here says that the Texas Lieutenant Governor, who's Dan Patrick, has personally requested President Trump to get involved in Senator Ted Cruz's reelection campaign. And it turns out that Patrick, who at that time, a number of years ago, was the chairman of Donald Trump's 2016 campaign in Texas, asked the White House officials during a July trip to Washington, D.C. about sending Donald Trump to the state to campaign on Ted Cruz's behalf. Lieutenant Governor argued that an appearance from Trump would provide the necessary turnout boost for state Republicans. And so Patrick reportedly requested that was soon followed by Ted Cruz saying he'd welcome a visit from Donald Trump during the campaign season. And, of course, late last month, you might remember the president followed through announcing he planned to hold a rally at the biggest stadium in Texas we can find. There's a problem with this, not the least of which is some of the words that were exchanged back and forth between Donald Trump and Ted Cruz. Don't you know that the moment President Trump steps off Air Force One, the press is going to be reminding him and everyone else about those statements? I'll read those in just a minute. But second of all, it also will drain resources that the Republican Senatorial Committee thought that it was going to be able to spend in Tennessee, Missouri, Montana, Idaho, Indiana, wherever, just all sorts of different places where they might have wanted to spend money. West Virginia is another one that comes to mind. And so as a result, this is taking political capital, that is President Donald Trump, and financial resources that weren't necessarily allocated there in the first place. And as I said, the difficulty is, how do you play this one out? This particular article reminds us that Trump and Cruz frequently exchanged barbs during the 2016 campaign. Donald Trump labored the senator lying Ted, mocked his family. Ted Cruz called the then candidate the sniveling coward and a pathological liar. You just know that's going to come up again. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that Representative O'Rourke is within 4 percentage points if you use the Real Clear Politics average. Another way to look at this is to look at the Cook Political Report, which is kind of a non-partisan, non-political forecaster, and it shifted the race from likely Republican to lean Republican. And frankly, if the trend continues, might even list it as a toss-up, which is pretty amazing. Which also brings me to another piece from the New York Times, in which the writers there say top Trump advisor says Ted Cruz could lose the Texas Senate race. And that is, you have two individuals, Mick Mulvaney, who is the federal budget director, and Ronna McDaniel, who's the Republican National Committee chairwoman, who in a closed-door event in New York City said that they believe that the Republicans will be able to turn back the blue wave in November, but they also questioned whether Democrats could marshal support, and actually because of the fact that there is such opposition to Donald Trump, and even due to the fact that they say he has a divisive personality, and maybe the fact that they also said that Ted Cruz might not have the charm to actually win a contested race. Now, Ted Cruz kind of fired back real quickly by saying that he's just some political guy in Washington. He's actually the federal budget director, but nevertheless, shows the amount of time and attention that may come to the state of Texas. Meanwhile, you have the former president, Barack Obama, who has returned to the political stage. Gary Bauer says that in some respects, even though the media has been talking about this return, his argument is the narrative is wrong. I would argue that Obama never left the scene, but he hasn't really been speaking to the issues. So I'll give half credit to the media, the way they've portrayed it here. And the point is that in one part of the speech, you have, of course, the former president, Barack Obama, claimed that he was responsible for the improved economic growth that we've seen. Gary Bauer's been on the program with us before. I love the line he used there. He said, well, it's kind of like a football coach with 8 losing seasons being replaced and then attempting to take credit for the turnaround that occurs under the new coach. So anyway, it's kind of fun. And also during the speech, one of the things that Gary Bauer pointed out is it did remind us of some of the speeches by Barack Obama. He referred to himself 102 times in the speech, but he is traveling around as well to try to get support for some of the Democratic candidates as well. And before I talk about those particular races, let me pick out one other thing that was very significant, because in that speech at the University of Illinois, President Barack Obama, former President Barack Obama, said, so Democrats aren't running on good old deals like higher minimum wage. They're running on good new ideas like Medicare for all. Well, Dr. Merrill Matthews said, it's not really a new idea. You can go back to the late 1940s and see President Harry Truman calling for this idea of a single-payer plan, and many even called for Medicare for seniors when it was passed in 1965 to be for more. But nevertheless, it is, I think, an interesting turnaround because, as you well know, some of the issues which for a while used to be outliers in the Democratic Party are becoming mainstream. A good example is former President Barack Obama. When he first ran, said he was not for same-sex marriage. By the time he left, he was a champion of same-sex marriage. Here's another example where he never really supported the idea of single payer, although I think he did, but he never said that he did. Now he's come out in full force. And it's just an illustration of what before was sort of an outlier. It was a position held by Bernie Sanders, maybe a few others. You're hard put to find anybody that will be running for the presidency in the Democratic primary 2 years from now who doesn't endorse Medicare for all, other than maybe Joe Biden hasn't really come out in favor of it, but probably will. And so it shows, again, what was sort of outside the mainstream has become mainstream in the Democratic Party. Just before we take a break, let me mention one other thing. My commentary today is what's called the Other House Race. It is based upon a piece that Karl Rove wrote about, because what you recognize is while we're looking at the races for Senate and Congress, we have to recognize there are some other important races, and those are races for the state legislatures. About 6,000 contests this fall, another 6,000 next year, and on and on. And right now, you are essentially electing in some of these places state senators. If they serve for 4 years, they will be the ones casting votes on the congressional redistricting plan. Now, when you look at our House races right now, Karl Rove, who looks at those numbers a lot more than the rest of us, if nothing else, says only about 60 of the 435 elections will be competitive, and those will ultimately determine who controls the House, either a Republican or a Democrat. So what I think is kind of intriguing is that once you redraw those districts again, given the fact that right now Republicans hold a sway in many more state legislatures than others, you can see that they could determine what might be the future. So the point I'm making, just as we take a break and I'll come back and take some phone calls, is nothing else. What I think is to pay attention, not only who you're going to vote for in your Senate race and your congressional race, but look at who you're going to vote for in these state races as well, because they are going to be the ones that ultimately will determine how those districts are drawn in just a few years. And so that's, again, the Other House race. We'll take a break, come back with some phone calls and some comments right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. A federal court in Oklahoma has ruled that despite the religious ardor of some of its adherents, environmentalism is not a religion. Randall Krause filed a lawsuit against the Tulsa County Library Commission. Evidently, the commission maintains a recycling program, and according to Krause, it constitutes an undue burden on the free exercise of his environmentalism. Krause alleged that the commission had placed fake recycling bins throughout town, victimizing him and other adherents to environmentalism. Well, the judge didn't buy the argument. Dismissing the case, the court explained that Krause had failed to establish that his environmentalism was anything more than personal preferences and secular beliefs without foundation in any religion. And even if it were, the fake recycling bins placed around town did not amount to a course of law meriting protection by the First Amendment. Determining what is a religion is difficult for any court, but as the Supreme Court has explained, religious beliefs need not be acceptable, logical, consistent, or comprehensible to others in order to merit First Amendment protection. But the court does require beliefs to be rooted in a religion in order to trigger protection under the religion clauses of the First Amendment. For now, at least in Tulsa, environmentalism does not constitute a valid religion, but it leaves me with one nagging question. Is a fake recycling bin just a trash can? To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join a conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let's go to Texas. First of all, KBJS. Patricia, what's on your mind today?
Hello. Thank you for taking my call. I just heard you talking about, I never knew how to pronounce that name, Beto or Beto or whatever.
He says Beto, so I'll take it, or
okay.
Representative O'Rourke.
Okay. Well, I know there's some people out there in Texas, but I don't know a single person that's going to vote for him because he's so anti-American ideas. And as far as President Trump and Cruz during the debates, I've heard him a while back say, a long time ago, that he's already put all that behind him. He's a big enough man to let bygones be bygones.
Yeah, I think he has. The media won't let him forget it, but yes, I think he's kind of moved on and already said he would welcome the help from the president, which gets to something I'm going to talk about in just a minute, whether the president has become a bad role model for children. We'll get into that in just a minute. But again, that's an important point because you're saying, you've never seen anybody that you know is going to vote for Representative O'Rourke, and yet if you go travel around the state of Texas, and again, listeners outside of the country don't maybe know this as well as some of us that live here, you see a lot of signs that say Beto. So it'll be interesting to see. It's a lot closer election than anybody would have ever experienced. I don't think the Cruz campaign experienced it and expected it to be like that. Certainly the Republican Senatorial Committee didn't expect it to be that way, and they're going to have to spend time, energy, resources, and political capital in a state that I don't think they were anticipating having to spend in. So it's kind of interesting.
But also, as far as Trump, I don't agree with his brash mouth, but he has done great things. And I don't know any little kids that's going to sit through listening to him on TV when there's other things they would much rather watch.
I would hope they change the channel. Yeah. Well, let me get into that because you raised a good point. And I did want to talk a little bit about bad role models or good role models. And let me take two real quickly. First, Serena Williams, because we mentioned that yesterday, and then Donald Trump. There's a new piece out here by Dennis Prager. Is the president a bad role model for children? Well, let's take our athletes' role models. And if they are, I thought it was intriguing to see some comments that came from Martina Navratilova. Now, most of us that have followed tennis remember her, an 18-time Grand Slam singles champion, outstanding tennis player. But interestingly enough, she had some things to say. Now, again, if you're not familiar with this, Serena Williams, during the U.S. Open, who in her defeat was cited 3 times by the chair umpire, Carlos Ramos, during the second set of her 6-2, 6-4 loss to Naomi Osaka in the singles final. The first penalty was for getting coaching signals, earning her a warning. The second penalty for breaking her racket cost her a point. The third penalty for berating Ramos and calling him a thief cost her a game. Okay, that's the background. Now, the argument from Serena Williams was that Ramos would not have penalized her so harshly if she were a man. And so you then had the WTA CEO, Steve Simon, agree with the statement that the organization believes that there should be no difference in the standards of tolerance provided to the emotions expressed by men versus women. But then goes on to say, we do not believe that was done on Saturday night. So here is how Martina Navratilova responded. She wrote that she thought the focus on sexism was missing the point. He says, we cannot measure ourselves by what we think we should be able to get away with. Instead, Martina Navratilova said, there have been many times when I was playing that I wanted to break my racket into 1,000 pieces. Then I thought about the kids watching, and I grudgingly held on to that racket. Later, she said, had I believed and behaved like that on the tennis court, I would have expected to get everything that happened to Serena. It shouldn't have ended with the point warning, but Serena just couldn't let it go. And then in the op-ed a little bit later, Navratilova said that she actually believed that there probably is a double standard for women when it comes to bad behavior punished, but that's not just in tennis. But however, she added, I don't believe it's a good idea to apply a standard of, well, if men get away with it, women should be able to. Rather, I think the question we have to ask ourselves is this. What is the right way to behave to honor our sport and to respect our opponents? I thought that was really good. And again, I know a lot of sports figures say, I'm not a role model. I'm just playing the sport. I don't plan on being a role model. Well, whether you think you are, you really are. Which brings us to the president. We talked about that yesterday. Well, let's come back to it as well. The latest Quinnipiac poll, interesting. About 90% of voters in America say the president should be a good role model for kids, but only 29% say that he is, while 69% say that he is not. And so that's kind of the response right now from the latest poll about that. That's why Dennis Prager, who's been on the program with us before, makes the point that as much as we would like the president to be a role model, we really need to focus on what he does. Now, in the best of all worlds, I've always said that you want somebody who's right on the issues, surrounds himself or herself with quality people, because lots of times it's the assistants and the various individuals around them that make the really key decisions. And number 3, that they have character. Those 3 issues are really important. In the best of all worlds, I like 3 out of 3. Don't always get 3 out of 3. So anyway, here's how Dennis Prager argues it, and I don't necessarily completely agree, but I wanted you to hear from him. He said that the role of the President of the United States is first and foremost to be a good president. If he or she is a personal role model, that's a lovely bonus, but it's only a bonus. He said, when I was young, I never regarded the President of the United States as a personal role model. That task fell on my father, my grandfather, my older brother, my uncles, my parents' friends, my teachers, my rabbis, and other older males. He says President Jimmy Carter was known to be a faithful and devoted husband and was not known for making false statements. But then he gets in a dig. He says only libelous ones after leaving office, like calling Israel an apartheid state. So what? Do conservative never-Trumpers think Jimmy Carter's personal integrity mattered more or his presidential decisions? And then goes through kind of what we just heard from Patricia a minute ago, all the things the president has achieved, lowest unemployment numbers and Supreme Court justices, defense spending, dealing with the issue of immigration, cutting regulations, on and on and on. Goes through quite a bit of that. And so at the end, he says, if nothing else, what should matter to every American is what was being done in the past to the country, the universities, the high schools, families, gender relations, and others by the previous administration. And so he ends with this comment: if your house were on fire, would you be more concerned with the character of the firefighters sent to extinguish the fire or their firefighting ability? Well, again, maybe is a sort of a backhanded defense of the lack of the president being a role model. Oh, we long for the days when we have a president that does the right things, says the right things, and is a role model, but that's not what we have right now. And if nothing else, just wanted you to think about that once again. It is amazing how people in politics, people in the media, people in entertainment say they're not a role model, but I want to break it to them. Yes, they are. Young people are learning lessons every day by how we act, and we have a responsibility to be the adults in the room and act responsibly and to act with civility. That's all we have for today. If you find yourself wanting to read some of these again, especially, I would point you to that first column that I've posted here by a New York City firefighter. It's available at our website. If you want to know more about this film, Surrender Only to One, or even the book War, Plague, and the World Series, it's all at our website, pointofview.net, as well as my commentary today on the other House race. I want to thank Andrew and Steve and Elisa for their help behind the scenes. Have a great day. We'll see you back here tomorrow on our Millennial Roundtable right here on Point of View.
It wasn't long ago, it seemed, every official decision brought religious liberty and our ability to live as faithful Christians into question. Some of us wondered how long it would be before we were literally forced to choose between obeying God or men. That pressure seems to have subsided just a bit, and now is the time not to take a breath, but to work as hard as we can for the future of our nation. Thanks to you, Point of View is doing just that. And our special thanks to those who have become members of Truth Team 360. In football, 22 guys battle it out on the field while 40 or 60,000 watch in the stands and perhaps hundreds of thousands more watch on television. We need a special few to get out of the seats and into the game. Join today by calling 1-800-347-5151 and ask to join the Truth Team, or visit us online at pointofview.net/team. We really do need you. The nation needs you. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really